Hello, everyone. I want to apologize for the technical difficulties from yesterday. Unfortunately, I had forgotten to turn the microphone on, which led to not getting any audio in the recording. So redoing the recording here so that you can catch up on the material. Don't forget that the next exam is on Tuesday. That's April 5th. So make sure to be preparing for that. If you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me about that. Don't forget as well that the last of the reflective essay is due on April 14th. So make sure to be keeping up with that and in keeping up with all of the reading quizzes that are left up through quiz 23. Just realized that I had not put up quiz 23, so it is now available. That's the last one, so it's not due until a couple of weeks. But I just wanted to remind you that you need to be keeping up with the reading quizzes as we finish through this semester. Today we are focusing on a slightly different group, slightly different approach. A lot of the religions we've been looking at so far have a very long history, at least several centuries, if not several millennia, in the case of several of these. Today, however, we're focusing on groups that predominantly have developed within the past century or so, from the 19th century on. And from a scholarly standpoint, these groups are often referred to as new religious movements. To suggest that these are groups that have recently developed. But it does also remind us that with respect to using the term new religious movement, that we're looking at something that is a little difficult when it comes to naming. And there are a lot of things tied up with the naming of this phenomenon of these movements that have developed recently, some of them connected with established religions, some of them not. Frequently, a lot of these groups are often termed cults, especially if they don't have any sort of antiquity to them. Usually, the term cult is a pejorative. It's not meant to be a positive term. It's a reflection of a judgment of a specific religious movement, and that there's usually something insidious or very concerning about a group that gets named a cult. And usually the term is meant to indicate that this group that we're talking about requires some sort of extreme commitment. That could be breaking ties with friends and family, maybe even leaving a job, maybe giving up all possessions, maybe going to live in a specific place with the other members of the group. But that idea of extreme commitment, usually to a very charismatic leader who is to be unquestioningly obeyed. And so usually when people use the term cult, that's the kind of group that they're talking about. Frequently people also talk about members who are a part of such groups as being brainwashed. The assumption is that people who join such movements are not thinking rationally. If they were, they would leave the movement, that somehow they have been indoctrinated or manipulated to see things, see life the way that the leader or the group wants them to see it, that they somehow have lost a realistic view of the world and of the group. And so often family members who are on the outside, right, looking in, here's your family member, your friend that's joined such a group, want to see this brainwashing removed, and so you'll hear of people, of even groups that are dedicated to deprogramming, deprogramming people who have been members of cults. Essentially, the idea is that certain psychological experts, and frequently people will identify themselves as such, right? They're an expert in deprogramming or an expert in cults. The idea is that the cult or the leader has programmed them to see things a certain way. They have to be deprogrammed. And so in order to leave the cult, they have to have this psychological process that will help them see things with the assumption that they'll see things as they really are, where the cult doesn't see things as they really are, is the assumption. All of these terms have some problems to them because they are imprecise. It's easy to look at groups and from the outside and misunderstand what's going on. This has even happened in the history of Christianity at various times and with various movements. So, you know, it's imprecise. What is a cult? In many respects, a lot of religious movements, a lot of churches have charismatic leaders, and so, you know, that's not in itself something to make something a cult. You know, it ignores the fact that sometimes people do rationally choose to belong to some sort of group like this. Even though many other people, and probably most of us, would say, you know, why would you join a group like that? Well, you see what's happening. You know, maybe they have made the rational decision to do that. You know, and certainly maybe it's not based on all facts, or maybe they're ignoring some things, but all of us do those kind of things. And so, you know, we got to be careful with how we throw some of this terminology around. And furthermore, you know, in thinking about this idea of brainwashing, you know, the idea is that they have been made to think or see the world around them as being a certain way, which, you know, should cause us to stop and ask, is mainstream culture brainwashed? I mean, essentially, that marketing relies on the idea of you know, people engaging in ways of thinking and seeing. And furthermore, in some sense, all religious groups engage in indoctrination and socialization. You know, you have to be, if you're joining a group, whether as a child growing up in it or as an outsider becoming an insider, you have to be indoctrinated. You have to learn, you know, what is expected, what the teachings are. You have to be socialized into the group, what actions are appropriate, what aren't. You know, certainly, having said all that, I don't mean to suggest that we shouldn't question the legitimacy of certain groups. I don't think that we shouldn't be concerned with the behaviors and practices. Just to suggest that, you know, we need to be careful how we throw around some of these terms before we have all the facts, before we understand what's going on. And so using the term cult may or may not be something that you know, that is useful in thinking about some movements. But in thinking about a cult from a sociological standpoint, it's important to kind of situate cults in contrast to some other types of nomenclature with respect to religious groups. And so in many respects, sociologists will sometimes talk about the differences between church and sect and cult. A church, in the sociological standpoint, is a group that fits into some larger community. Now, that could be a fitting into a larger community within that religion, right? So a congregation fitting into the universal church. You might think that within Christianity. It could be a group that's fairly integrated into society. Right? There isn't there's certainly this distinction between the group and the society, but not a great disjuncture, not something, a radical separation like some other groups. Many of these groups are also, that would be termed churches by the sociological standpoint, would be traditions that have been around for a while, they're well established. Another type of religious group is the sect. The sect is usually a break-off group from a larger tradition, develops within a tradition, but has rejected something within that tradition or within that society or community and gone in a different direction. These groups tend to be newer because they break off within established traditions. They also tend to emphasize separation, look at the either the group that they've broken off from or society as a whole as being opposed to their beliefs. There can be a notion of radical separation in the sense of, let's say a sect within Christianity would say, that the universal church at large is gone the wrong way, and so we don't recognize them as Christians, or society is so opposed to us, we need to be separate from society. And so usually the sect is a break-off. Usually they may or may not think of themselves as having the only truth of reality or the religion, etc. The cult, however, is even further separated from society than the sect. Cults may or may not develop within established traditions. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it might be an amalgamation of traditions, right? A kind of approach where you're taking some elements of Christianity and some elements of Buddhism and some elements of some other religion, or it could be, completely outside of it. Most times, these groups are under the influence, the teaching of a very charismatic leader. Usually there might also be a requirement of accepting what the leader says, but and then also the idea of being marginalized, they're really separate from society. Society kind of distances themselves, and the group within it, the people within the group distance themselves as well. Within that term cult, sociologists have also broken it down into further groups. Audience cults, client cults, and then the cult movement. An audience cult is essentially a group, a development where people are connected with the teachings of a charismatic individual, but there isn't any sort of conversion required, usually very minimal commitment. You're not making too much of a commitment to the leader or to a group. And usually there's some sort of buffet approach to spirituality. You can take some of the things that the leader is saying, but you can also have, some of the of your own traditions or traditions, other traditions. You probably think of like a lot of self-help gurus. People like Dr. Oz or somebody like that, who, yes, they want you to buy their books, but as far as the commitment, it's reading the book or watching them on TV or something like that. It's not any sort of conversion or separation. And if you want to be a Christian and watch Dr. Oz doesn't care about that, right? Something like that. A client cult requires a little bit more of a commitment. Usually there's some sort of service offered, like maybe a therapeutic service. With that, there's this kind of pay-as-you-go. Still not client cults would tend to be kind of easy to join, but also easy to leave. It would require a little bit more commitment than the audience cult. But as far as your major day-to-day life, it might not make that much of an impact. You know, and we might get into, you know, if there's a specific, maybe a weight loss plan or something like that, where you know, the plan requires you to buy something specifically from the individual or the organization, right? This kind of, you know, pay-as-you-go idea where, you know, if you decide to stop doing the program, you can leave, right? And so there's not that obligation of you're stuck now, which is slightly different, of course, than the cult movement. Usually cult movements require that total commitment. You know, you're fully converted to be a part of the faithful. And that might even require, as we've said before, this you know, breaking of allegiances, leaving family, other types of things like that, where you're kind of giving up your old identity and adopting your new identity. And so, you know, even to the point of living in a compound somewhere with just other believers. Also, thinking from a sociological perspective, many cults tend to fall under a broader sociological view known as revitalization movements. Revitalization movements tend to be these attempts by an individual or a movement to construct a more satisfying culture. You know, this deliberate attempt to make changes in the culture that will solve problems that exist within it. You know, something's wrong in the world, and so here is the means to change that. You know, at the top, or in the origins of a revitalization movement, is the charismatic figure. Right? This is the individual who has a vision. That could be supernatural, that could be not, right? But has at least a vision of what's wrong with culture and what needs to be changed. Now, of course, it doesn't just end there. That person will then gather followers who share that vision, who want to see, you know, that change, who believe that this charismatic figure has some sort of power or authority. You know, based on the claims or their experience. Again, that could be supernatural, that could be not. Right? It could be somebody claiming, well, I've had this vision from God. It could be somebody saying, you know, I've studied Scripture and here's some aspect of Scripture that will help us change society. The big question with revitalization movements, and really new religious movements in specific, is the question of what happens when the leader dies. You know, in many respects, depending on how authority is routinized, and yes, routinization is a real term, depending on how that authority becomes a routine part of the life of that religious movement will kind of give us some idea as to whether it is likely to continue or not. You know, if authority is solely bound up in the charismatic leader, the likelihood of it breaking apart upon that leader's death is very high. Right? If there, you know, if there's no tangible expression of that authority that continues, that could be, you know, naming a successor, right? That this is the person that's going to lead the community. That could be leaving a group of texts, some writings that people can appeal to or study. Those kind of things routinize authority that allow movements to continue on past the death of the founder. Usually it might also require some sort of institution building as well, whether that's a board hierarchy, whether that's some sort of rituals connected with authority. You know, there's all sorts of things that this can find expression, but unless that's become a part of that group before the death of the founder or shortly after, you know, the likelihood is that those kind of things will disappear. The goal of the revitalization movement then right? That next stage, right? So you have the charismatic leader who hopefully gathers disciples, who hopefully routinize authority so that it can perpetuate. The goal, of course, is to make that change. That change that was originally the problem here. Certainly, many revitalization movements never get to this point. It's very rare that this happens. In some respects, we could look at Christianity as a revitalization movement within Judaism. I think it's obviously more than that, but from a sociological standpoint, we could look at it as a way of thinking about how Christianity develops, saying, and okay, this is an example of what starts off as a revitalization movement. Jesus, while he's teaching something new, is also trying to call people back to following of God, based on the heart, right? So again, I think it's more than that as a Christian. But from a sociological standpoint, we can say, okay, it kind of fits into this pattern and is one where, there's that influence of society, great influence historically. But some of these there have been plenty of other new religious movements in the history of Western society that die off, usually within a generation or two of its leaders. New religious movements especially, and again, probably not surprisingly, face a lot of opposition, especially as they're starting out, but also as people get to know about them and hear about them and maybe some of their ideas, and that opposition can take a variety of forms. One might be simply humor or sarcastic comments. Oh, do you know what those people believe? They believe, and oh, that's crazy. Why would anybody believe that? And so it could just be something like that, and joking about certain groups of people coming to your door and wanting you to buy this or read this or something like that. Still can be obviously very hurtful to the individual or the group, but a minimal form of opposition. Once we start moving on, though, we can see that opposition can take other forms as well. Marginalization within the society. Humor might start off as the way you're opposed, but maybe further and further, all right, we don't want those kind of people here. Right? They don't belong here. If you're going to be that way, you need to live over in this part of town, or you need to live outside of town, or we don't serve your kind here. All of those kinds of things would be efforts of marginalization, trying to keep people outside of society and get them out of the mainstream and the influential parts of society. But that opposition can also escalate, and has in a variety of places with a variety of groups, to the loss of rights, to legislation, either forbidding the group or putting a lot of burden upon the group. This even happens in the United States, where supposedly we have religious freedom, but the government and the courts often say there are limits to that freedom, and based on a variety of approaches to society. And so, we can see it even here, but it's definitely more extensive in some other places with some specific groups. We won't talk about Scientology now. Hopefully, we'll have the chance to pick it up in a later class. But that's a group especially that has faced a lot of legislation and legislative opposition in places like Germany, some other places like that, where even though there's technically religious freedom, they don't look at Scientology as a religious movement, and so they've kind of curtailed the rights of Scientologists, created a variety of legislation. And then, of course, opposition might go to the extremes of people being arrested, people being thrown in prison, loss of possessions or property, maybe even death. Less likely these days, but in some countries, still a possibility that it could happen. And so a lot of opposition. So thinking about all this opposition, how is it that these new religious movements last in the face of all of this? Well, there's a couple other things. We talked about the need for routinization, but there's a couple other things that are often necessary for a new religious movement to continue. And I think that if you look at some groups that would fit into this umbrella that are still very existing and very prominent ones, you see these kind of things. And I think of specifically here the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. In the early years, there was a lot of opposition to Mormonism. People being arrested, people being kicked out of town, sometimes even executions. There was a lot of fear, and Mormonism was looked upon as a threat by a lot of people. But one of the things that I think is occurred within Mormonism, it's still a group that faces a lot of opposition of the humor and sarcastic kind. It's still a group that is not totally integrated into American society in all ways with all people, but it's much more of an accepted group than it was in the 1830s, for example. And one of the things that I think has been a part of that is this way in which Mormonism has become less threatening. And so new religious movements last because they find that balance, or they try to find that balance between not being a threat to society, yet also being distinctive enough where it is different. Right? And so you have to, be distinctive enough that people will say, okay, you're offering something different, but you don't want to be too crazy or require too much that people are turned off, right? You want me to do what? I'm not going to do that. I don't want to be a part of that group. So finding that balance is very important for new religious movements to last. Also very important, and this is important for religions in general, is making those bonds between practitioners. You need to encourage people to remain committed to each other, to develop close relationships. Have something to focus on, something that can be handed on from generation to generation. The important stories of the founder, something that draws people together, and then also something that is appealing to outsiders. What is it that would make this something people would want to be a part of? New religious movements, of course, also last if the social setting is positive toward that kind of thing. And what I mean by that is new religious movements last in places where there is religious, spiritual, emotional, psychological instability. And so if it's a society where everything's going good, new religious movements might not have too much to appeal to. But if it's a society where crime is on the rise, or there are great fears about something happening, or society, there's been a lot of corruption in society or religion or government, those are the places where new religious movements can find fertile ground to develop and last. Like I said, if everything's going good, it's not as likely that people are going to be interested in joining such a group. If they can critique mainstream religions, they can point to hypocrisy or misdealing with finances or some other aspect of saying, look, this religion or these leaders, they're not truly concerned about spirituality. They're concerned about money or power or prestige. If they can do that, they can kind of offer an alternative that might be appealing to people. Very important for new religious movements especially is not just appealing to outsiders, but really keeping those younger generations. Unless they can keep those younger generations, they are not going to survive. In many cases, these new religious movements, while they might bring in some people, often it is not enough to replace those that are leaving once they get older. Once they get older, then once they get older, where they can make their own decisions. Sorry, I've kind of blanked there a minute. Once they get older, where they can make their own decisions, they have the opportunity where they can leave, and so that makes it difficult, to try and keep people if the kids think that it's too weird, right? If they're concerned that they're going to appear too strange to their peers, they're less likely to stay. What is it that makes new religious movements appealing? Why is it that people join them? Now, yes, there might be some sort of manipulation or deception that occurs, but as far as like genuine groups that are really trying to develop, a religious response, or people that are genuinely convinced that they have the right path, they're appealing for a variety of reasons to people. Some people are just interested in alternative belief systems. Right? They're just interested in the new, the different, sometimes the strange. That becomes a challenge for us that might not. Why would you join something like that? Well, people just don't like the status quo sometimes, and so they like being different and participating in different types of things. Now, most people don't. Most people don't like that idea of being different or strange. But there are people that are like that. Might be appealing because of, if you're a person who's marginalized in society for a variety of reasons, you might find a new religious group appealing because you might think, well, they know how I feel. They have experienced marginalization. They're on the outskirts of society. I'm on the outskirts of society. That might be a reason to join. Is that, well, this is a place for me finally. This is a group I can participate with, who I can relate to. For some, the criticism that a group has of mainstream society might be appealing. Right? That if you personally feel there's something wrong with society, and then you hear somebody else saying the same kinds of things, that might be a reason to join. Just the charisma of the leader or the charisma of the people that are a part of it, right? The appeal there, it's, this guy seems really nice, or, the people that are a part of it, they seem very happy, they seem very settled, they seem very stable. All of those kind of things make something appealing that otherwise we might not think would be appealing. We turn now from talking about some of the theory and attendant issues of new religious movements to looking at a couple of different religious movements, new religious movements. I don't want to suggest that these are, what's the word I'm looking for, that these are any sort of, serving as exemplars of every group is like this. Nor do we really have the time to talk about all sorts of new religious movements. And so this is a very selective examination of some groups. Furthermore, we just don't have the time to look in detail of any one of these groups. Some of these groups, or some new religious movements, we could probably take an entire semester looking at the groups, or just new religious movements as a as a group. But these, I think, are some rather interesting ones that show you a wide extreme of where new religious movements might fall. One set of groups are those that probably most people would accept calling cults. These extreme examples of what we see. And these are especially extreme examples, right? These are not representative examples of new religious movements at all. Because in many respects, these are groups that ended with mass death. But still have some very interesting histories and stories. The first is the People's Temple. The People's Temple was started by a man named Jim Jones. Jim Jones was a pastor affiliated with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And, he was a very successful minister, very charismatic individual. He was especially different, not just because of, eventually developing a cult, but, at the time period he's living, the 50s and 60s, and then into the 70s when a lot of things start happening, he was advanced with respect to race and integration. So the People's Temple, as it develops, is integrated. He's open to equality and harmony. He's teaching that, and that's probably part of the appeal that a lot of people saw in the People's Temple, was this interest in promoting equality. The Disciples of Christ is a mainline denomination. It developed out of the same kind of stirrings that led to the American Restoration Movement. That's part of the heritage of the Churches of Christ, which is what Faulkner is affiliated with. But there's a variety of things that led to splits between the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. But one of the things that, and both though would be fairly mainstream in their theology. The People's Temple, however, Jones kind of moves more towards Pentecostalism, and in his early career starts teaching or practicing faith healing, and would later make the claims that he had raised people from the dead, that he had cured cancer, other things like that. Eventually, in the late 1960s, he moved the church from Indianapolis to California, and becomes very popular in California. There was one group of the People's Temple that stayed in Indianapolis. He moves another group to California, becomes successful there. He is recognized by a bunch of civic organizations. He is named a humanitarian. He's named one of the most influential clergymen by a religious magazine. So in a lot of ways, he is well respected in the community and in other places. In 1973, the church buys 27,000 acres in the country of Guyana in South America. With ostensibly, this is to start a mission down there. And it's beginning in the 1970s that things start getting a concern. A variety of rumors start floating around. Right? He's been recognized, he's been given awards, but then the rumors of financial misdealings, of beatings, of other type of intimidation, brainwashing. There's even accusations or rumors of murders. And so Jones takes a rather sizable group down to Guyana to escape some of this, which is called, the area becomes known as Jonestown. Well, once this group goes down, a lot of the family and friends remaining in the States become very concerned about this and what's happening to their friends and family. So they're trying to file lawsuits. They're trying to file lawsuits. They are trying to appeal to Congress, to other political leaders to do something about this. Well, in November of 1978, Representative Leo Ryan of California travels down to Guyana, flies down there to see what's going on. And as he, talks with many of the people of Jonestown, most of them seem to be very happy where they are. There's not there doesn't appear to be people kind of imprisoned against their will or anything like that. There are a handful of people who are interested in returning back to the United States. And so they are going to leave with Ryan. It appears to Ryan that they are being, it's okay, yeah, if you want, there's no reason you have to stay here. Nobody's going to force you to stay. If you want to go back to your friends and family, that's fine. On November 18th at 4 p.m., right, November 18th, 1978, Ryan and others are getting ready to board an airplane at the airport when they are shot and killed. An hour later, Jim Jones starts a process of what's known as White Night. White Night involved the suicide of all the members of Jonestown. Most of them, most of the 914 that died from drinking Kool-Aid, which had been laced with cyanide. And so, if you've heard the phrase "drink the Kool-Aid," I haven't drunk the Kool-Aid, or I have drunk the Kool-Aid. It's coming from this the fact that here are these people who, many of them willingly, from all indications, drank this Kool-Aid, knowing what was in it. That's one of the further strange parts about all this, is that there appears to have been a trial run of this, that without the cyanide, and so White Night had been practiced. I guess the assumption or the belief was it was going to be needed. Right? So the people knew what was going on, or at least appeared to, or had the possibility of know what's going on. So most died from the Kool-Aid. 4, including Jones, died from gunshots. Some people had puncture wounds on them. There were about 260 children that died, most likely from the Kool-Aid that was given to them by their parents. Dogs, livestock, other animals were poisoned as well. About 100 people escaped this, either because they were away at the time or they fled when all of this was going on. After the assassination of Representative Ryan, of course, the FBI are called in to investigate. They come upon Jonestown. You might not be able to make it out too well in that picture, but towards the back of the picture on the right, that's what they found. It's just the compound littered with bodies. You can find online a copy of the White Night service. Jones evidently taped a lot of his sermons and those kind of things down there, and you can hear the people, listen to the people talking to each other, and talking to Jones, and Jones telling them what to do about all of this. It's really kind of eerie, to think that these people are just minutes away from killing themselves. But those tapes were found, of course, once the FBI started investigating. Another group with a violent end, the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians started as a movement within Seventh-day Adventism, but some of their teachings and practices led to the Seventh-day Adventists rejecting them and saying, that's not what Adventism is all about, and so kind of, distancing themselves from this. Eventually, leadership in a sizable portion of the Branch Davidians passes to a man named Vernon Howell, who will change his name to David Koresh. He joins the group after he had been excommunicated from the Seventh-day Adventists. He begins to really gain some followers, rise through the ranks, but a variety of accusations about the group start to be made, including that they're practicing polygamy, that the children are being abused, that they are stockpiling weapons. And so the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms begins to investigate. In 1992, they raided the compound of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. There's an exchange of gunfire, and 4 of the agents died. Well, now the FBI gets involved because of the death of federal agents, and they put the compound in Waco under siege, and it's blockaded, in a sense, for 51 days. Eventually, the Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, under the Bill Clinton administration, permits the FBI to go in. So they storm the compound. They break in through the walls with tanks. And in the midst of all this, a fire started, as you can see in this picture down in the lower right. Fire started. There's the exchange of gunfire. 76 people die. 20 of those were from gunshots. But it's a very disturbing end for the Branch Davidians. And then the last group I want to talk about here, with as far as these groups that meet violent ends, is Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate began in the 1970s with a belief that the planet Earth was soon to be recycled or destroyed. And the goal was to get off of Earth before that happened. And to get off of Earth, you had to hate Earth in order to leave. And so you kind of develop this mindset of hating the world. It continues on for a couple of decades, doesn't really ever grow that large. In 1997, though, the leader of the group, a man named Marshall Applewhite, becomes convinced that there is a UFO, a spaceship, trailing in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet, which is coming close to the United States, or coming close to Earth, and so a lot of people are interested in seeing it and these things. But Heaven's Gate believes that this UFO is coming to take them away. And so Applewhite convinces the people that in order to board this spaceship and leave Earth, they have to give up their physical bodies so that their souls could board this spaceship. And so in March of 1997, 38 followers, and Applewhite, gave up their physical bodies by downing phenobarbital that had been mixed with applesauce or with pudding, washed that down with vodka, put bags over their heads. All of them, all 39, were later discovered wearing, as you can see in this, in the third picture there, black sweatpants and brand new black and white Nikes. And for several days in March of 1997, these shots were all over the news. These bodies, partially covered up with, these black and white Nikes, right? And these black that they had gone out and bought to die in. And another aspect of this that's really eerie as well is that the Heaven's Gate website is still active. Right? 1997, internet is still in its infancy. It's not widely used, but the website from Heaven's Gate is still there. It, supposedly exactly like it was in 1997. I've been to the website, but I'm assuming from the things I've read that it is relatively unchanged. I mean, there's nothing really talking about things too much after 1997. So somebody, of course, is paying for the hosting or something. Somebody is allowing that to stay up. But really kind of weird postscript to an already disturbing situation. Let's turn to some other groups that are less extreme, still sometimes branded as cults, some of them, but certainly not any of this violence that we see here. Let's start with the Unification Movement. The Unification Movement was started by a man named Sun Myung Moon. He was born in 1920 in Korea. He would go on to proclaim, he kind of starts within Christianity, and Christianity in Korea at the time was often practiced in secret because of the communist government. But Moon begins to claim that he and his wife have been selected to be messiahs. And, in a Korea where there is a lot of expectation in the 20th century among Christians of the soon return of Jesus, here is this person claiming that Jesus came to him in a vision around 1935, and that he was to finish the work that Jesus had started. Right? That God's plan, the claim is, that God's plan wasn't for Jesus to die, and so his work was cut short. Work was left unfinished. This responsibility is passed to Moon in the 1930s, supposedly. And out of that, one of the key things that becomes a part of this growing movement is the unification principle. Essentially, the idea is that God created the universe to show true love, which grows through human family. But people tend to be selfish. And so what we had to do is, live for others. Now, and that in itself, of course, sounds okay. But again, we're talking about some of the other trappings that are a little problematic. Right? Moon claiming to be a Messiah. He also claimed to be the third Adam. Right? So there was God created Adam, and then Jesus is the second Adam, according to Paul. And so Moon is saying he's now the third Adam. The movement, as you might expect, has faced a lot of persecution for the first half of the 20th century in Korea, especially North Korea, which was persecuting all sorts of religious groups, not just the Unification Movement. Moon was arrested. At some points he was tortured, left for dead, arrested again, sentenced to hard labor, but eventually freed by American forces during some of the conflict in the 20th century with Korea. And so he leaves Korea to travel to the United States. In the United States, he would hold huge rallies, bringing in a lot of people together, and there's sizable growth that takes place proportionately of the group in the United States. But it starts gaining some negative attention. People that are joining are referred to as Moonies. So there's that humor or sarcasm that's attached to it. One rather interesting ritual of the group are these massive wedding ceremonies where thousands of people would be married at one time. I don't know if you can quite make it out on the picture, but you can definitely see in the first couple rows these people dressed as brides and grooms. Well, that goes the whole way back as far as you can see in the picture. And so, people would be brought together. And in most of these cases, it might be people that never had met before, and yet suddenly they're standing before Moon and his wife getting married. They were paired up by Moon. Now, sometimes some of those individuals here might have been people that were already married, and they're participating in this ceremony as a way to kind of rededicate their lives to the church's teaching. The group has had some influence, or Moon has had some influence, responsible for creating a variety of conferences, professional conferences, especially on religion. It owns several newspapers, including, I believe, the Washington Post. They own a university, the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut, and Moon at various times has had access to presidents, largely because of his belief as him being a political prisoner who had withstood communist North Korea. Moon died in 2012. Since then, there's been kind of a question of succession. The idea was that it would pass on in his family line, but there were a couple of different sons, and so people weren't sure which son to follow. And then there's a daughter that's kind of mixed in there as well. And so there's been a lot, I don't know, I haven't read anything recently about any sort of stabilizing of the group after Moon's death. But that it will remain to be seen if this group will last into the subsequent generations. Another new religious movement that has become more and more popular in the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st is Baha'i. Baha'i comes out of Islam. Islam serves as the kind of foundation for it, but it's not a form of Islam. Right? So it starts within Islam, but most Muslims would not, a majority, I wouldn't think too many would actually kind of recognize Baha'i. And Baha'i would say it's distinct from Islam, but would make connection with Islam, but it wouldn't necessarily want to hold to being Islamic either. Anyway, so we talked about in Islam this 12th Imam in Shia Islam, who has supposedly gone into hiding in the 900s and has been revealing guidance since then from hiding. Well, within Shia Islam, there was this notion that the 12th Imam makes his will known through these individuals called gates, or Babs, B-A-B. So there's this idea of using these people to communicate to Shia Islam. Well, in 1844, there was a man named Ali Muhammad who claimed to be the Bab. And he does so at the Great Mosque in Mecca. And so this kind of causes a lot of problems. Because the people that are supporting him believe that he is the Mahdi. He is this messianic type figure in Islam. They believe that he's a prophet of God. Muslims, on the other hand, people that aren't following the Bab, say Muhammad was the last prophet of God. You are not a prophet of God. So he's arrested. Violence erupts between the supporters and the detractors. Some claim as many as 22,000 people are killed in all of this. Ali Muhammad is eventually executed, but prior to his death, makes the claim that another prophet would come that the people, his supporters, should follow. Eventually, it's identified that a man named Hussein Ali is this prophet. Now, there's a lot of difference and tension about that, but eventually, the group that becomes Baha'i settles on this man named Hussein Ali. He has the name Baha'u'llah, which means glory of God. And his followers become Baha'is, followers of Baha'u'llah. And so he kind of takes off over from where the Bab had left off. Now, again, it's not surprising that, even as this movement is becoming Baha'i, there's a lot of opposition from Muslims. Muhammad was the last prophet of God for them, and there are no other prophets. To take this mantle is to commit blasphemy. Plus, they're kind of opposing Muslim leadership, and so Baha'is face persecution, exile. I believe Baha'u'llah eventually makes it to the United States, but there's this spread that takes place from the persecution. One of the things also that is different between Baha'i and Islam, and also different from other groups, is the way in which Baha'i is very eclectic in drawing together a variety of religious traditions. The claim is that there has been 9 different Babs, 9 different gates to God, gateways to God. In some ways they are manifestations of God, but they are solely prophets. They are human. These individuals, these Babs, spoke to their culture, so their message is situated in their culture, but have essentially said the same message no matter what time period they've been in. But Baha'i also has a notion of progressive revelation or evolution to it, in that each of these Babs throughout time have offered more revelation or a greater message than the others, provide greater insight. So the 9 manifestations are Abraham, Krishna, Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab, and Baha'u'llah. And so they're bringing together these different traditions, these different religious teachers, kind of creating a harmonious type of religion, right? So one of the goals is to create religious harmony. But they also would say that part of the problem is the followers of each of these individuals misunderstood, misinterpreted what those manifestations were saying, which is why it was necessary for subsequent individuals, subsequent Babs, to return. For a while, leadership in Baha'i was based on appointed successors, and you appoint the leader to lead after your death. But today it's morphed into a representative government of several different levels. There's government, there's leaders by region, leaders by nation, leaders internationally. Baha'is are monotheistic. They only believe in one God, even though, of course, we would say, well, there's a lot of difference between Krishna and how Hindus talk about Krishna in the divine way versus how Abraham, Jesus, even Muhammad talked about God. But Baha'is are monotheistic. There's one creator. There's one God. He is unknowable. But he is made manifest through the prophets who act as divine messengers. Other Baha'i principles include notions of unity, unity of humanity, all religions having the same foundation, unity of science and religion. They also encourage equality among the sexes. They also teach, however, that an individual must independently come to truth. And so there isn't a professional religious class, a clergy, right, or priests or preachers. There's not that kind of level within Baha'i. Everybody's kind of encouraged to come to truth by themselves, not through what others tell you. And so if somebody tells you something, you should investigate it for yourself. They also want to see a unity in language and government, right, thinking that this will bring peace. Some numbers are very important in Baha'i. 2 of them that are important are the number 9, suggesting unity and diversity because you have the 9 manifestations. There are 9 members of Baha'i on each of the different levels of government. Baha'i temples, like those pictured here, have 9 entrances into them. The number 19 is also important. The Baha'i calendar is 19 months of 19 days. And then there are a couple other days to equal 365. During that last month, that 19 month, people are encouraged to fast, very similar to the practice of Ramadan. Most Baha'is practice worship at home. You're expected to pray to God daily, be involved in frequent devotions, to gather with other Baha'is in your home, where there will be prayers, meditations, readings from a variety of scriptural traditions, the teachings of a variety of religious leaders. There is some worship that occurs at temples throughout the world. Those temples are 9-sided, many of them with domes. In temple worship, there's the same kind of similar types of things, devotional types of services, readings from scriptures of a variety of religions. There may be choir singing. Those would be unaccompanied or a cappella. There are about 5 million Baha'is in 230 countries around the world. So not a large group by some of our standards, you know, when we think about the size of Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, but still a rather sizable group that is present in a wide variety of places. The last group that we will talk about, spend some time on, is the Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses started in the 19th century. It was a time period in the United States where a lot of people were interested in the return of Jesus. When's he going to return? What's his return going to be like? Studying the Bible for those kind of things, and that's something that really garnered the interest of a man named Charles Taze Russell. He was a Presbyterian, but in his late teen years, he kind of became disaffected with Presbyterianism, especially as he begins to read a variety of Adventist groups, their literature. He begins studying biblical prophecy. And so he's really interested in studying Daniel, Revelation, those kind of things. And so he starts getting people together to study the Bible, for him to share his views. Right? He's only 18 at the time. And so he's not starting a new denomination, doesn't think of it as a new denomination. He's just starting Bible studies with people already in other denominations. Now, eventually the group will split off. But what they're particularly interested in are Russell's views. I mean, he is one of the few people in the 19th and 20th century who have attempted to date the return. So not only is he interested in when Jesus is going to return, he actually gives a date. There have been very few people that have done anything like that. I mean, yes, there was one just a couple of years ago, but it's not been that prevalent of an expression. People might say it's coming soon, we see the signs of it coming, but most people aren't going to give a date. Well, Russell, throughout his life, gave a variety of dates. 1878, 1914 was another date. Jehovah's Witnesses picked up with that for a while. 1975 was kind of the last date that was given to when this would take place. Not only does Russell begin having these Bible studies, he also begins to write, and writes a lot of material. And in one of the few organizational developments during his lifetime, starts the Zion's Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. The goal of this is to publish Russell's information, to publish his studies in Scripture, to provide things that people can study from, as well as things that people can share with others to try and show them why they believe these things are true. And so Zion's Watchtower Bible Tract Society becomes the publishing arm and the only official organization within what will become the Jehovah's Witnesses. It started in Pennsylvania, but eventually moved to Brooklyn. I believe I've heard that they're actually thinking of moving from Brooklyn now, maybe to upstate New York. But the goal is here to produce this information. Russell dies in 1916, and for a while there's a breakup between a variety of groups kind of splintering off, but the mainstream group, the major group, follows the leadership of a man named Joseph Rutherford. He was a lawyer, but was frequently called Judge Rutherford. Judge Rutherford is the one who really systematizes this group into the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he's the one that gives it the name in 1931 of the Jehovah's Witnesses. But he also brings a lot of institutional backing to it, where people are required to spend a certain amount of time evangelizing door to door, and then record those hours, and those hours are going to be reviewed, those kind of things. And so really adds a lot of systematizing and institutionalizing. And so gradually this group that had started as just a Bible study group morphs into the Jehovah's Witnesses. And over the first part of the 20th century really codifies a lot of the teachings and practices that will be a part of what makes this group distinct. So what are some of the things that make this group distinct? One had to do with their kind of separation from countries. Right? So eventually the groups start spreading throughout the world, but one of the tenets of Jehovah's Witnesses is that they don't have an allegiance to any human institution. And so when World War I starts, and the United States gets involved in World War I, the Jehovah's Witnesses refuse to serve in the American Army. In fact, are also very vocal in producing anti-war literature. And not surprisingly, that will lead to a variety of persecution. And so they adopt this rather pacifistic stance that they are not going to be involved in the war. Now, it's not a true pacifistic stance. They believe that when Jesus returns to fight the Battle of Armageddon, that they will fight in Jehovah's army. And I should mention that Jehovah's Witnesses, the term Jehovah, is very important. It's believed to be the personal name of God. A lot of people in the 19th and 20th century thought that that's how you should pronounce the Hebrew for God's personal name. Most people believe most scholars believe today that it's probably more something like Yahweh and not Jehovah. But the Jehovah's Witnesses took that as God's personal name that they should use exclusively. And so they believe that they'll fight in Jehovah's army, so they're not against fighting. It's just the idea of giving your allegiance to a nation that is engaged in warfare. Well, this kind of thing, the anti-war approach, and then the Sedition Act of 1918, people were arrested, people were beaten, presses were destroyed so that they couldn't publish this literature, all those kinds of things. This lack of allegiance has led to a variety of other issues for Jehovah's Witnesses. One of the major things was the Supreme Court cases that have involved Jehovah's Witnesses. Over 40 cases have come before the Supreme Court in the relatively brief history of this group related to Jehovah's Witnesses' beliefs and practices. One of the first was refusal of some students who were in families of Jehovah's Witnesses to salute the flag. The first case was in 1940, and they lost. But in 1943, a different case was found in their favor, allowing Jehovah's Witnesses not to salute the flag. They can refuse to salute the flag. Now, of course, that means everybody else can as well refuse to salute the flag. And so this, these freedoms, these First Amendment freedoms, are really kind of developed. Some of them are developed through these court cases. There have been other cases as well, things like being able to evangelize door to door, being able to hand out religious literature in public spaces, the right to reject symbols of allegiance, the question of blood transfusions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So all sorts of different cases have come before the Supreme Court related to religious freedoms in the First Amendment. Not only did witnesses face persecution in the United States because of the lack of allegiance in Nazi Germany, Jehovah's Witnesses were thrown into concentration camps. Certainly, the Holocaust was focused predominantly on Jews, but other groups, including Jehovah's Witnesses, also found themselves facing the death chambers because of their refusal to ally themselves with the government of Nazi Germany. What are some other beliefs and practices? One rather prominent one that a lot of people would know about Jehovah's Witnesses is that they refuse to have blood transfusions. The reason for this refusal has to do with commands in the Bible against eating blood. In both the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are specific commands that people are not to eat blood. Now, your initial response might be, well, that's not how you get a blood transfusion. And that's true, and it's not that Jehovah's Witnesses don't know that. But they take those commands and broadly understand them. It's not just eating blood through your mouth, but it's bringing blood into your body in any manner. And so that's why they will refuse the blood transfusion, is that although it's not technically eating blood, it is taking blood into your body. In some cases, of course, if there's a major surgery coming months down the road, some people might store their own blood for transfusion, just to minimize some of the possible effects of getting somebody else's blood put in your system. Not so with Jehovah's Witnesses. Even that is discouraged and condemned. Are there Jehovah's Witnesses that get blood transfusions? Yes. But the official position is that this is wrong. This is not something to be done. Of course, the big issue is with children who need a life-saving transfusion. And so there have been issues where Jehovah's Witnesses have refused that. And then, of course, the Child Protective Services or some other type of organization has gotten involved in that. They don't have any problems with other types of medical care or the transfusion of non-blood products, which has kind of served as a foundation for some medical research universities like UCLA to be involved in trying to develop bloodless surgeries or other types of things that would allow not just Jehovah's Witnesses but other people the opportunity to minimize the need for transfusions. Another belief has to do with the cross. Jehovah's Witnesses had believed that crosses, traditional crosses, the T-cross, had largely become an idol among Christians. Found in architecture, found on clothing, earrings, other types of jewelry. The Christians were just idolizing the cross. And there were other claims by Jehovah's Witnesses that Jesus didn't even die on a traditional cross, but died on a torture stake. So, as in the picture, right, a straight pole with his hands and feet nailed to it. And so, that's something else that makes them distinct. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. The Jehovah's Witnesses also tend to be Unitarian. They believe in the monotheism, but reject the idea that Jesus is divine or that the Holy Spirit is divine. In fact, usually Jesus is understood as a created being. Most cases it seems to be that they're talking about the Archangel Michael, who becomes a human being known as Jesus of Nazareth. The Holy Spirit, obviously the Bible talks about the Holy Spirit. They would say, no, it's not a person or being, but the force or power of God. And so there's the distinctions made there with respect to that. Another important practice has to do with, again, that continued interest in the end times. Pulling from some passages from Revelation, Russell taught that from the time of Jesus to the end of time, that there would be 144,000 people who would make up the church that would, at the end of time, go to heaven. The rest of people who would be, followers of Jesus would live on a reconstructed earth. And so the 144,000, right, a huge company of people are going to be saved. But only this very special class of people, the 144,000, are going to be able to reign with Jesus. There isn't the notion of hell within Jehovah's Witnesses. Instead, the belief is that those evil and wicked souls will be annihilated. They won't suffer punishment eternally in hell, but they will cease to exist. And so that in itself will be the punishment, not enjoying the joys of the reconstructed earth. While Mormons have an additional set of scriptures, right, the Book of Mormon, Jehovah's Witnesses have a translation of the Christian scriptures. So the New World Translation is a translation of the Bible, the Old and New Testament. But it has it incorporates witness teaching into it. So instead of saying cross, it will say torture stake. It will use the term Jehovah exclusively, even in places where the Hebrew word for God's personal name is not used. So like the New Testament, right? In the New Testament, many cases, it's the word theos or kyrios, so God or Lord. In cases where whoever's developing the translation believed that it was talking about God, Jehovah. They put Jehovah in there. And so even though Jehovah is not found in the New Testament, Yahweh is not found in the New Testament, in the New World Translation you will find Jehovah when it's talking about God, what we call God the Father. Jehovah's Witnesses meet in buildings known as kingdom halls, usually very simple in style. The main focus of the kingdom halls is education. And so Jehovah's Witnesses gather there several times a week for study. Usually the main focus is on the biblical study material for that particular week to prepare for witnesses going out and sharing that message, and so that they're prepared to talk about those things, pick up other types of material that they will hand out. Evangelism, of course, very important among Jehovah's Witnesses. There still is the expectation that you will put in a certain amount of time evangelizing, usually door to door. In 2005, Jehovah's Witnesses logged in almost 1.3 billion hours of evangelizing. In 2011, it was 1.74 billion hours in evangelizing, or publishing, as it's called. And that's out of the most recent numbers I had of 7.5 million people out there. So very important. Last thing, talking about practice, is the practice of communion, or the memorial, or what's known as the Lord's evening meal. While most people within Christianity would observe it kind of regularly, some people might do it monthly, some people might do it quarterly, weekly. Catholics in some places can get it daily. Jehovah's Witnesses only observe it once a year on the night of Passover, believing that that's when Jesus instituted it and that's the time when it should be observed. However, the idea is that only members of the 144,000 are allowed to take of the Lord's evening meal. Right? If you're not a member, you shouldn't take it. And so, you're talking about gatherings of 19, 20 million people across the world where a majority of people are not taking it. Now, in the 1990s, it was probably about 9,000 that actually took the Lord's evening meal. In recent years, that's gone up, which you would think it actually go the other way. But the overall number is that fewer people take it than are present. And so, this picture here from a Jehovah's Witness website, most of those people are probably just passing it by. Right? They're not actually taking it. One of the things, though, that's interesting here is the pressure that must exist to not take it. If you think of it in most other, in Christian groups, that most people would be pressured to take it, right? I mean, because you would be, people would wonder, well, why aren't you taking it? If you're a member of the church or whatever. But, since only 144,000 are supposed to take it, to actually take it kind of suggests something, like you think yourself one of this elite group. And so actually the opposite pressure might exist than what you see in other situations. That brings us to the end of talking about these new religious groups. Don't forget the exam coming up, and don't forget as well the last essay coming up here in a couple of weeks.